Thank you. Namaste. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. Uh, I'm overwhelmed because our Vice Chancellor is sparing in his praise. And this certificate he gives me, I always hold very dear to my heart. So thank you, Raj, especially. But thank you also to my esteemed colleague, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, for his kind words. And we are really, it's a matter of honor for me that people who have served this country with distinction for its national interests are assembled here and who think that my 2 cents are worth their time and effort to read and to comment and to deliberate upon. So thank you to all the distinguished panelists and most of all to Dr. Arvind Gupta, because he's taken out time today and as he heads a very important think tank in this country, VIF, and thank you, sir, for being here and for blessing this new book of mine. I just wanted to reflect on why I wrote this book for the interest of the audience and what I intend from this publication. Just yesterday, I overheard very fascinating one-on-one between Arnab Goswami and Dr. S. Jaishankar, our foreign minister. And Arnab, being Arnab, he asked a very, tough question. He says, how do you deal with Trump? And Dr. Jaishankar, moved a bit in his chair and adjusted his pose. And then he said, my job is to work with the American system to remind them that we have common interests. It stayed in my mind. And then I said, yeah, that's exactly what I wrote in the book too, right? That there is a system and then there is Trump. And this dichotomy struck me early on, as early as the 2016 US presidential election campaign. And the more I studied, and like every one of you here, I don't think anyone thought that Trump had even an outside chance of winning, right? But it happened. And once it's happened, we are all scrambling to understand this phenomenon. And so even though Trump has profoundly changed the world without even wanting to do so, the point is that he has done it and we have not understood it well or well enough. And perhaps, the personality and this, king-size ego and all the outrageous things he says, and his, reality television persona, that thing probably makes many people dismiss him or take him lightly. But the more I realized it, he has had systemic impact. And the more I realized this difference between the what we call the deep state, as many people call it in the Trump camp, the populists, and the steady state and the populists, this tussle between the two, I have taken as the basis for this book. And the more I went into it, I realized that generally the international relations literature does not look so much into the what we call the black box of domestic politics. We tend to think that a state formulates its national interests and then engages with the rest of the world in a bargaining, give and take, for tactics and strategy to attain its interests. We don't actually unpack the black box and look inside the domestic politics to understand what is it, how is this national interest formulated in the first place. And those of you who are in the academic field, I don't want to bore you with jargon. The theory of liberalism basically asks you to look inside and to see how national interest is formulated in the first place or reformulated, which is what Trump is doing. The America that you had assumed since Franklin Roosevelt is no more. And the more I studied it, the more you had to get deeper into domestic and then connect it with the global. So that is my job, as a scholar, and that's what I've tried to do, join the dots between this profound domestic, even a violent shift or an insurgency, and how it refracted upon the way the US has dealt with the rest of the world, and how that's going to completely change the way the international system is. So that's my basic point, world order and how it's shifting, and how, and the other point with regard to the shift is I have taken on the critics of Trump So some of you may be curious, am I pro-Trump or anti-Trump? My last book, it was very clear, I'm pro-Modi, I still am. But this one has nothing to do with my judgment of him or his politics. Rather, I'm looking at the impact and the effects that he's having. And there, I'm saying that it's a mix of both, but especially for what I call the middle layer, rising powers, it's actually a major window of opportunity. And unwittingly, there is a law of unintended consequences in history. So Trump does not intend for any of these effects to happen, but they're happening. And I believe it's my duty as a social scientist to capture those and to explicate for the general public. I've written this for the IR academic community, but also for curious, intelligent readers who don't necessarily have to be specialists. And what I'm saying essentially here is the more the Trump phenomenon expands, and it's not just related to him as an individual, the less likely it is that the United States will be maintaining its role as a liberal global hegemon. And this is a hard fact for many people to digest. Probably some will challenge me on this, and I'm happy to debate. The idea that the United States is bound to lead, as Joseph Nye used to say, who's at Harvard now, bound to lead. And the idea that they had some kind of a manifest destiny to shape the global order. This was a quintessential liberal idea from FDR, at least until Obama. And what I'm seeing is that surely we are moving away from that. And Trump is in a way is like a catalyst of this process. So it's not so much about Trump the individual. I'm talking about deeper forces rooted in the domestic politics that we need to understand today's world. But it's not only American domestic politics. This book is about the rising powers. So in a way, it's like a simultaneous movement I'm showing between the decline of the United States in terms of providing leadership on the world stage and the simultaneous rise of what I call the middle layer of powers. Let me explain what I mean by the middle layer. Conventionally, most people say that China and the United States are the two great powers of our time, and then there is this whole layer of developing countries and the Europeans and a few others. They don't matter so much in the power stakes. It's basically, a tug of war between these two for influence and for domination of the world. And if you see the narrative about the trade war, which I have covered in the introduction of the book, there is indeed a prognosis for a kind of a decoupling of the US and the Chinese economies, and that these two blocks will go their separate ways and will become less interdependent. And they will then ensnare the rest of the world into their respective spheres of influence. But as an Indian scholar, as someone who has come out of the tradition of the global South and the belief in the idea of South-South cooperation, I was more and more troubled with this narrative that, well, the US and China are going to shape the world. If the US withdraws, as Trump is doing, it's game over and the Chinese are going to take over. That's essentially the thesis. You hear a lot of this commentary in Western liberal critics of Trump. Many of them say that America should not abandon hegemony, liberal hegemony, because otherwise we are going to give it on a platter to the Chinese. They're going to take over the institutions, they're going to shape the rules and the regulations and the standards, they're going to dominate the developing world with their aid and with their diplomacy, and eventually, even militarily, they're going to establish bases all over the world, and it's a transfer of superpowerdom from the United States to China. That's the scenario, the scare scenario created by a lot of Western liberals who are alarmed at Trump's total redefinition of US national interests. Now, I'm saying in this book that, look, this is actually an ignorant debate, because you are forgetting that there is a powerful layer of regional powers, what we call the middle layer of regional powers, that is neither interested in liberal US hegemony or in authoritarian Chinese hegemony. And who do I mean by these countries? These are countries that have had long histories of regional leaderships in the developing world. So in this book, I have four cases. India, obviously, in Asia, I have Turkey from the Middle East, I have Nigeria from Africa, and I have Brazil from Latin America. And I chose these four on the basis of how representative they are of their respective regions, how much they have had a historical role in providing leadership in their respective regions, and even beyond their respective immediate neighborhoods. And my thesis, if some of you who are from academia will bear me out, the theory of bandwagoning supposes that if the US is withdrawing, then the smaller countries in the developing world have no option but to gravitate towards China for aid, for investment, for military protection, and essentially for survival. And I've given many examples in this book of smaller countries, not this middle layer, weaker countries in these four continents, or the Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, in these four regions, which are already gravitating towards China out of desperation. In our region, for example, the Philippines is the best example. Many of them are highly uncertain about Trump. It already started with Obama, but now it's very, very advanced. The commitment very United States, as it's called, and the allies, partners, most of them are looking around for how do I survive? And so bandwagoning assumes that the US is withdrawing, Trump is disinterested, Trump is bored of being what he calls the global sheriff, and he's very inward looking, and so what do? We have to gravitate towards China and survive. Well, these middle layer or rising powers actually are not interested in gravitating towards China. They have their own ambitions for regional and global leadership. So this book is the story of this middle layer, juxtaposed with this maverick administration and this phenomenon of what we call right-wing populism that's sweeping many parts of not just the US but also in Europe, and surprisingly even in a large developing country like Brazil. So populism on one side, Chinese expansionism on the other side. What do the rising powers do? My view is that they have a historic chance to fill the vacuum that's been left by Trump. And the United States still remains relevant in our national interests of all these countries. For Brazil, it's important. For India, it's important. For Nigeria, it's important. For Turkey, it is, it's a NATO ally still. I'm not saying that they're going to completely cut off from the United States. They continue to leverage the United States, as our foreign minister was saying yesterday, to make the American system, if not Trump and the populists within the US system, work for Indian interests. The Brazilians are doing the same, the Nigerians have the same game, and Turkey, of course, the master doing this, playing off different factions within the US complex American state establishment. But that's not the end of the story. They are providing net security and stability and prosperity in their neighborhoods, in their regions. They are not abandoning their regions to China. In fact, they are wary of creeping Chinese expansionism in their respective areas. They're not happy about it. They would have, probably some of these countries would have still liked the United States to be around. If not bossing around, at least being present. But with Trump, as you've recently seen with the withdrawal from Syria, and northern Syria, and the ongoing phased withdrawal from Afghanistan, with Trump and those domestic forces which are pulling the US inward, it's very hard to rely on it. So what do? You are on your own. And you need to build your own plurilateral combinations and formations to lead your respective regions and to provide regional governance that can add up to a global order, a new global order, which is multipolar. That's my basic point. Most people would say it's a bipolar world today, and that essentially it's kind of like a Cold War, but without the same kind of ideological edge between China and the US like you had between Soviet Union and the US. But my thesis is that we are moving very fast, rapidly towards multipolarity, even though the gap between China and these regional powers is still high in terms of military or economic might. In our respective regions, we are competitive with China, all these countries. But that's not enough to be competitive in terms of ability to project power and resources, to be able to counterbalance China. What we also need is political will. And that again takes me back to domestic politics of these countries. So I went back and I really, really studied, as our Vice Chancellor was saying, new areas. I did a lot of work on what's happening inside Brazil. Seismic shift. What's happening inside Nigeria. what's happening around Nigeria, in West Africa and across Africa, what's happening with Turkey and its troublesome neighborhood, and of course in India, luckily we have a much more stable order, and how are we adjusting to this new shift that's underway. So that was the premise, and the way I worked it is, if you read the book, the introduction is about Trump and the US domestic factors and the tremendous shift and the withdrawal from global leadership on one hand, and on the other hand, in many of these countries, many of them are also struggling with this political will to be able to step up to the challenge of of regional and global leadership. So they're not all ready yet. In my book, if you see, my own assessment is that Nigeria under Muhammadu Buhari and India under Narendra Modi are relatively better prepared to step up and fill the vacuum and to do our own thing in our respective regions. My assessment is Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro and Turkey under Tayyip Erdogan are not ready to actually play a regional leadership role that unifies the region behind them and that projects, and that solves the major crises in their respective regions. So I've studied, for example, the whole Venezuela situation and why Brazil is not able to intervene to solve it. The Sahel region in West Africa, why Nigeria is not able to step in and solve it, or should be able to, but is being stymied by France, even though the United States is withdrawing from many parts of Africa. Why India cannot resolve the Afghanistan imbroglio? Do we not have the mettle and the ability to do a form of a regional coalition of our own to be able to stabilize this war-torn country and the Indo-Pacific in a broader sense, find balance of power through our own endogenous means, without necessarily fully depending on the United States, even though the US, as I said, remains a factor for all these countries. And that's because of the other side of the US establishment. So what I'm trying to say, and likewise for Turkey, the question with Erdogan is, 17 years in power, he has lost it, I'm sorry to say. And my estimation is that he's unable to really win over either the Arabs or the Persians or the Jewish in the region, who are his neighbors. And he's antagonized all sides. And therefore, he's really struggling. Turkey has the capacity and the potential, but lacks the political vision for the future to offer the leadership that it could offer. So therefore, the talk that Russia will come in and Russia is going to dominate the Middle East now. Why can't Turkey do it? That's because it's divided, because the field is divided. So if the field is divided and the region is not willing to go along with you, how can you avoid an extra regional power from coming in and becoming dominant? That's the challenge for these powers. And I've laid this out in great detail, and I hope you'll read it. It's a global book. The Modi doctrine is very India-centric, but this one, I spread it out, and I'm still, as I said, very hopeful about Nigeria and India, especially, less so about Turkey and Brazil. But then political will can transform over time. A lot of domestic factors matter, coalitions, interest groups, and of course ideology and popular will. What is the role of the intelligentsia in these countries? Brazil, such a great intellectual tradition. Can they actually maintain that status of being leaders of the global south under this kind of regime? I have doubts. But nonetheless, it's a tussle. So in every country, not just in the US, I think the winds, the global winds are such that we have to look at much closer at domestic politics, much more than we in the IR fraternity did before. And therefore, from inward to outward, the kind of the two-way movement between these, that's what I'm showing in this book. And as far as policy recommendations go, I think these regional powers have it in them. They have the population sizes, huge countries. Each of them, India is, of course, we have 1.3 billion. Brazil is a big country. By Latin standards, a very large country in terms of population, landmass. Turkey is a big country by Middle Eastern standards. Nigeria is the largest, 200 million people. So what I'm trying to say is, the power. Yesterday, Dr. Jaishankar was saying, Arnab asked him, what is your projection of India by 2030? And Dr. Jaishankar says, I think about our immense talent of our people, our demographic dividend and our demographic advantage. So the reason I picked these 4 countries, not just because they have historically played leadership roles in their respective regions, but also because they have the tremendous potential of latent growth and of latent leadership and of latent vision to try and shape the world in a multipolar direction. So I urge you all to read it. I want to mention a few people, especially in the audience, who've come here and who mean a lot to me. Before I close, my wife, my 2 children are here, and I've acknowledged them profoundly. My mom and dad have come from Odisha. Thank you. They've made a huge. All of them are acknowledged formally, but they're present in the audience, and that's all I need. I want to thank also my respected mother-in-law and father-in-law who are here from Andhra, and they're here too. I want to thank my aunt who has come from Pune. Thank you so much, you mean a lot. I want to thank all the distinguished members in the audience who've cared for what I've said and written in the past. And I hope that end of the day, I believe I'm a provocateur. I still believe that I'm setting, Trump is of course the ultimate provocateur, but I am trying to, in an intelligent way, in an informed way, trying to throw a match at the haystacks and telling you all, let's wake up. This is a historic chance. The stable genius, as he calls himself, has really set up a nice platform for a multipolar world. We're moving away from an American century or an American order. Edward Luce wrote about an American century in 1941 or 42 in Time magazine. And we are now in 2020, I believe, of 2041, which is going to be the 100th anniversary of Edward Luce's famous article of talking about the American century. I think we will be well past it. And I would dare say, from an Indian point of view, from the point of view of the rising South, it's not such a bad outcome. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Professor Rajkumar, the bridegroom, Professor Chaulia, my many friends here, Ambassador Meera Shankar, Mr. Jitendra, there is Harsh Pant there, the members of the diplomatic corps, members of the media and friends. I really don't know what to say because I wanted to talk a little about the author, but I think Professor Rajkumar and Mohan Kumar have done much better than I. I wanted to talk about the book a little bit, but I think the author himself, and quite rightly. So I'm really in a dilemma as to what shall I say. And of course, you are going to have the dessert very soon. That is the panel discussion, and Ambassador Meera Shankar and Smita Sharma and others are here. So there is very little for me to say. But let me try and in the next few minutes just make a few points. The first is that I must congratulate the author, not because he has written 4 books and several thousand articles, but because in this book he brings out some wonderful arguments. I have always been an advocate of developing Indian narratives by Indian scholars on issues not just which concern India, but global issues. And I think this is one book. At such a young age, he has come up with a very bold assertions, confident assertions. And if a politician says that, look, India has arrived and we will do this and we will do that, that is okay. That's probably also good. But when the young generation starts saying that I think instills hope. So his book is a very confident assertion that countries like India and other countries that he had mentioned, and of course the middle powers and emerging powers, now they can take advantage of this shifting world order. And I think we need to see more books coming in this vein, where India, its position is analyzed in an objective way. And we must be able to say things on global issues. So talk about Nigeria, talk about Venezuela, talk about Brazil, talk about Syria, talk about this, and connect it with India, and help India to take positions, help Indians to take positions. Because India is now there almost in every country. We have interests everywhere. So this book is in that direction, and that is why I congratulate the author for writing this book. And triggering, I think, a debate. I'm sure the debate is surely going to follow because he has made several sessions, and I'm sure there will be many views, and this will only enrich the debate. And so that's one I think I should start with, that the book helps to bring forward Indian non-Western viewpoints and perspectives and arguments on key global issues. Having said that, I think his key argument is also very powerful. That since the world order is shifting, and of course there can be a lot of debate about the US decline, about the role of China, the US-China relations, whether the US will decline, and this decline will continue or no, what will happen after Trump, which could be next year or it could be after 5 years. Whether, and you, as you yourself point out, that in the US history there have been many swings. The US has gone isolationist, and then it became a global power. And I think the debate about the US role began during Obama's time itself. Because this Pax Americana, the cost of Pax Americana, its impact on America, that has been talked about in the US academic circles, in political circles, etc. And that's what Trump has done. But Obama came to opposite conclusion. The two came actually to opposite conclusions. Whereas Obama wanted to solve this problem of what is the role of the US by more engagement, by more of multilateralism and so on. He has arrived at a totally opposite conclusion, as you have pointed out. But whether the US will be able to withdraw fully, or whether it is only a temporary phenomena, that of course we will have to see, because the US interests are there everywhere. And there is a debate within the US academic circles, even with the US administration, deep state. So I don't think we have yet quite reached that conclusion. And the fact that, and all these academics point out that the US power, and it's so far ahead in so many areas. And even if it declines, it will take a long time to decline. But I think the rise of China is, there are hardly any rules left. Or the new challenges which are coming, we don't have norms and rules to negotiate those challenges. So the emerging powers are not just going to be impacted just by the US positions and the Chinese positions, but also by these factors in which many others are there. Look at, for instance, G20. You know, emerging powers, new world order, the G20 is very important. But what is G20? If you read the Osaka Declaration, and I was reading it a few days ago, it reads like, I don't know whether I can use that word, but maybe this is evening and I'm out of the government. It reads like a joke. They just put together, if you look at their 2018 and 2019, and we did about 80% of it was the same. No movement, no nothing. And when you begin to discuss specific issues like cybersecurity, etc., or even things like taxation, you know, or the cross-border data flows, or the taxation on e-commerce and those kind of things, there are no ideas left anymore. So what will be the shape of multilateralism? I think these are the issues which are ultimately going to decide whether emerging powers like India, they will be able to take advantage of the opportunities which are arising. I think there is also a very important issue of culture. You know, you have talked about these countries. India is certainly a civilizational state. India's influence has been there on so many countries, and India's diaspora is very important. Turkey. Why is it that Turkey will not be accepted by the Middle East? It is because of the history of Ottoman Empire and the new Ottomanism, and which is what they are promoting. So then I come to these four countries. India, of course, as I said, India is it's a multi-engagement, multi-alignments, call it hedging or whatever, but we are developing our relationships, but we are developing very close relationship with the US. But the other country like Turkey, and you correctly pointed out, this is not going to be accepted as a leader by the Middle East. In fact, Turkish factor and Iranian factor these are actually divisive factors in the Middle East politics. So whether they can show that capacity to lead regional coalitions is very doubtful. I don't know much about Nigeria, but I read your chapter on Nigeria and a little bit of discussions that we have with the Nigerians. I think Africa is also similar in the similar. Who is the leader in Africa? You have South Africa, you have Nigeria. We know that the Security Council reforms, who will be there from Africa, that has been held up because the Africans have not been able to come to a conclusion. And you have mentioned that Nigeria has not ratified the Africa Continental Free Trade. And Nigeria has many internal problems. Boko Haram is still an issue. And of course, their economy is still based on just oil. So I think each of these countries that you mentioned, and I can talk about others also, which are not here, but which are also middling powers, they all have their big problems. And it is because of this that you find that China has been able to make inroads. Now, what do you do with the Chinese inroads, which are through the BRI and other methods are there in practically every continent? So whether people like it or no, they are there. So I think the problem that you have raised, the question that you have asked is wonderful, that in this new multipolar world, essentially it boils down to what will be the shape of a multipolar world. It is there, everybody can see it, but the old world is still existing, and the old rivalries and the balance of power issues, etc., are still there, but they are changing. New factors have come in, and it is in this new multipolar world, how do you bring stability? How do you, rather than, will it be a stable world or will it be a chaotic world? So what will be that cementing glue? Earlier, of course, you had the global policeman and Pax Americana. Earlier, before that, Pax Britannica, and then Pax Americana, etc. All that is changing. But then there is, what is that cementing glue? Because the lack of norms in practically every area, that is becoming more and more apparent. So it is in this world that we are passing through, and of course this transition might take a fairly long time. It may take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or maybe more. And during this period, many black swan events would happen, and I think that will continue to change our thinking about the world. But coming back to what we should do, I think certainly we have to, as far as India is concerned, and we are on the right track, I think, trying to build Indian capabilities. But to that you have added this, trying to build an Indian narrative. Where do we want to be there? We must have a very well-argued, convincing narrative for others to see. And that should be based on culture, our history, and on our experience. And I think we should take our civilizational our civilizational attributes in our foreign policy. That must come. Otherwise, of course, in the normal international relations theory, you can talk about balances of power, net balances, and net analysis, and so on. It will take you somewhere, but it will not give you that depth. So for depth to come, I think we must, and this is very much a domestic issue also. I think the domestic policies, as you correctly pointed out, domestic policies are extremely important. So let us try and build a certain consensus on our national interests. After a lot of debate and consultations, and bring culture, bring the military, the other components of power into our narrative, and then receive and be an objective thing. Just by, we cannot be rhetorical. We cannot afford to be rhetorical. We have to engage with the world. We cannot become inwards. US is trying to become inward, but I don't think it will. It can survive for very long if it becomes totally inward. So some kind of engagement will be there. But in that engagement, how do we put forward our view? How do we build our strengths? I think that is what we should do. And your book, reading through this, I think raises many of these questions. I'm sorry, I have not read it in great detail, so maybe all these are there, because I got the book only on Monday, and on Tuesday I read it, and I had a seminar which I have just finished. So I have not really been not a thorough reading of the book, but I'm sure we'll pick up some of these points in the panel discussion. So let me congratulate you and the family who have produced such a brilliant scholar. And I want to put you out of misery, don't blush. But I think you've done a great job, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks for that.
So, without much ado, can I just begin with the panel discussion, please? And in some ways, this is, I think, the substantive part of the program as well. Not that the previous part of the program was unimportant. So, I think those of you who are really keen followers of the subject, can I begin with the introduction on just to my left, and I'll go, it's not just a pleasure but a privilege to actually introduce Ambassador Meera Shankar, one of our finest, if I may say so, in the Foreign Service, and was the first career diplomat actually to be appointed as India's ambassador to Washington. I still remember when you join the service, you have ambitions, and I joined in 1981, and we would never say, as part of even the ambition, that I want to be India's ambassador to Washington. You could say you want to be foreign secretary, because that was a job reserved pretty much for the Indian Foreign Service. But the India's ambassador to Washington was always a political post, until Ambassador Meera Shankar came on the scene. So a double accomplishment, if you like, the first female ambassador as well, but more importantly, I would say, career diplomat. And that was it was quite a turning point. And since then, we haven't looked back. So really a great pleasure, ma'am, and thank you for taking time out. Smita Sharma, also we go back actually quite a bit of time when I was Joint Secretary BSM, but she's an independent journalist who works for ETV Bharat and or contributes to ETV Bharat and Huffington Post, and writes quite extensively on foreign affairs and security matters. So it's a great pleasure to have you. I think it really would be wrong for me to introduce Professor Harshwardhan, frankly, because if you don't know him, then in many ways you should leave. Sorry. I think anybody who follows the foreign policy, and there are two people leaving. Okay, so this is. I'm sorry if I'm doing damage to Sreeram. I really sincerely meant that, because if you're following foreign policy, you have to know Harshwardhan. I mean, he's just writing. He's the only guy who can rival Sreeram in that sense. You know, he's so prolific, and not just that, in almost all meetings. So he's now director at ORF. He's also a professor at King's College London. But thank you so much for taking time out. Then we have, last but not the least, you know, the panel would have been incomplete without an American. An American, if you like. There might be other passports which are American, but you know, we needed you desperately. So thank you so much, Mark, if I can call you Mark, University of Connecticut, but also a Fulbright Nehru Fellow. And it's great to have somebody from the United States follow matters of South Asia, having looked at foreign relations history and so on. So since many people have to leave around 8, we will try to keep it really brief, to the point, and try to whet your appetite before we also offer you a dinner. So if I can begin with Ambassador Meera Shankar, but what I probably have to do is give 5 minutes to each person. Please don't exceed 5 minutes. Just opening remarks, and then I will try and see if I can pin you down with questions which hopefully will be relevant to the experience that you have. And it's interesting, we have a former diplomat, we have a journalist, we have a think tanker and a scholar, and we have a think tanker and a scholar. So it's really great in that sense that we've got different perspectives on the kind of questions that Sreeram has raised in his wonderful book. So Ambassador Meera Shankar, if I can request you just for 5 minutes, opening remarks. I mean, you've done US, you've been there, you've done that. How do you see this now unfolding, especially in the context?
Well, in the book, Professor Chaulia basically makes the point that Trump may have his own personal idiosyncrasies, but he also represents a broader trend. And the interesting thing he says is that the US has veered between eras of intense liberal internationalism, where it has engaged with the world, set up alliances, acquired bases, and sought to maintain balances of power throughout the world, and periods of intense isolationism when it has felt that it's overextended and that this overextension internationally is bringing it no benefits, and therefore it needs to concentrate itself internally. And he sees that Trump is not just, a representing his own personal idiosyncrasies, but a trend. Now, he also mentions that there are analysts who link this to eras of what are called threat or eras of safety. And he sees that since the World War, the US has almost always perceived a threat, whether it was fascism, or then it was communism, or then it was jihadi terrorism. But right now, it doesn't face that kind of imminent threat. So when it is in an era of threat, where the threat predominates, then it seeks this very active engagement with the outside world, shoring up alliances and so on. But when it is in an era of relative safety, it tends to question these or the value of these and to look inwards. So therefore, given that there have been these swings in US policy, I'm not sure that you can take the current trend of isolationism as one which is going to be there in perpetuity. Will it change? You've had these eras, you've had these swings, and as I see it actually, while there may be no imminent threat to the US, there is an increasing realization within the US of the challenge that China poses. And perhaps it's a far greater challenge than the communist bloc ever posed. So is it that the US will be able to cope with this challenge from a position of isolationism, or will they again be drawn out into the world to handle this challenge? I think the jury is still out, and it's a little early to come to conclusions. The other point that he makes is that this is an opportunity for middle powers or emerging powers, because there's no inevitability of a world where the US is in decline, and therefore the emergence of a Sino-centric world, where countries will have no option but to gravitate towards China's magnetic pull, both on economic and military and political grounds. So he says that's not inevitable, and that actually emerging powers should see this as an opportunity to shape a multipolar world, because they would rather not be under anybody's hegemony, neither American nor Chinese, and therefore this American withdrawal from the world at the moment gives them the space to try and fashion alternatives which would be more multipolar. Here again, the question I would ask, and I think it's an entirely laudable idea and a laudable objective, the question I would ask is, each of these countries has their internal vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities and lack of capacities in many sectors actually sap their capacity to act as really effective agents in the international system. Will they be able to overcome it and actually realize this potential, or will it remain always as countries with potential who are unable to achieve it? I think the last thing we need to do, because he mentions India as one of the countries in with this potential to shape a multipolar world, is what is it that India needs to do domestically and internally to build the capabilities to be a more effective actor internationally? Because I think it will flow from basically our domestic capacities. If we don't build those economic, technical, other capacities, then I think we are not in a position to realize our potential.
Thank you. I thought you anticipated already some of the questions that I'd be asking you. But talking of potential, Sri Gopal Krishna Gandhi was my High Commissioner in Colombo, and I was his Deputy High Commissioner. The Chinese diplomat once told Gopal Krishna Gandhi, somewhat pejoratively, as you know now, when I say it. He said India is a country of great potential and is likely to remain one. So, you know, Gopal Krishnani looked at me and I looked at him and I said, but that was China. I mean, we're talking now 2004, but even now they could say that. But thank you so much. I think you delineated some of the questions for the debate. Smita, can I request you also to spend 5 minutes perhaps following up on what Ambassador Meera Shankar said, but I leave it to you. This is, I mean, after this we will have a guided debate, but this is really a free-flowing opening remark, so suit yourself.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Ambassador Mohan Kumar. Congratulations, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. We've been fellow panelists on a couple of TV shows where we found each other on the opposite ends of the spectrum, the ideological spectrum. And that is what, in fact, the book also manages to do, because I think it does manage to provoke, it does manage to raise questions. And disclaimer, like Dr. Arvind Gupta, I also really haven't had the time to go through all the subjects in details, but initially whatever I have read through, and let me also say that as a right now, as I'm seated on this very, very esteemed dais of well-informed experts, I must say that Harsh Pant and Dr. Sreeram Chaulia make my life very difficult as a print journalist who by the time has to wake up in the morning and decide what is the topic that maybe I can write a column on. They've already published and they're sending links out. And as a television journalist of 16 years, today Ambassador Mohan Kumar is definitely making my life much more complicated, given that it was much easier asking questions, and today he's the grilling anchor here on the dais. But I think, as what Sreeram's book essentially, and as Ambassador Meera Shankar here just spoke about, that what the book aims to bring out, it makes you think that really, of course, all of us talk about the significant shifts in American foreign policy, especially post-Cold War, not just the significant shifts, but also the constant sort of struggles that they've had to face, the constant battles that are still continuing. And why you have a post-Trump era today, after the post-American world, you're not now talking about a post-Trump era, but how much of it is going to stay, regardless of a Trump being in office or not? Or how much of it is really reflective of the way America today itself has changed? I mean, even if President Trump today, and we don't know where the impeachment proceedings will finally end up, but even with the President Trump not being president anymore, has he led to a far deeper, significant American polarization? I mean, we are living in polarized times, of course. In India itself today, we are as polarized. The debate is as polarized as the American debates. And in the India chapter, where you mentioned that emerging market economies, including India, have found themselves on the receiving end of the US Federal Reserve's monetary tightening and raising of interest rates, including India, have found raising of interest rates policies that serve Trump's goal of domestic economic growth, but impair investment and liquidity in the developing world. So the constant conflict that we have seen here of the American first, which is of course not a first really, if you look at American history, and all of you are well informed about it, but that constant focus, how much of it is in conflict, in contradiction with the larger multilateral or reform multilateralism, as Prime Minister Modi puts it, that we are either trying to steer for or trying to battle for. I think these are issues that Sreeram manages to raise in the book. And just to, as a final comment, because I would be happy to give more time for the debates, two important books that were released this year by political commentators and Trump critics on the left and the right. And if you look at the title names, I mean, one, The Man Who Sold America, Trump and the Unraveling of the American Story. This is by Joy and Red and William Morrow. And the other one is The Death of Politics, How to Heal a Frayed Republic After Trump. So it's very clear that Trump, whether a statesman or not, has definitely managed to change the entire discourse, the entire conversation about not just America as it is to the world today, the change in the global foreign policy, but I think America today now faces challenges both inwards and outwards. And these shifts are reflected by these titles, and it's definitely changed my life as a journalist, my sympathies with my American counterparts, whose lives have completely changed ever since Trump took to Twitter. Thank you so much.
very difficult one. I think let me take half a minute more and just say how pleased I am to be here, and especially I think to be on this panel for a book by Sreeram, because I think not only is he, as we have heard, is he a good scholar, but I think fundamentally he's a very nice human being, and you know, that's something we have heard everyone saying, and I think that's there are many good scholars around, and you can you can read their books and learn much. But I think in this day and age where everyone is so worked up about everything else in life, to be a very genteel, nice human being is certainly a better tribute to be paid to an individual, as we have heard over the last over the last half or an hour or so. So I think it's wonderful to be here, and Sreeram has been a long-standing friend, and I have read his work with great interest. So this is a book which is, I think, perhaps is very ambitious in its scale and scope, and also in more ways than one raises some of the more fundamental questions that as observers of international relations we have been asking ourselves and of our students and of our interlocutors, that the world is changing, of course, but how do you make sense of this changing world? And change is the only constant, but in this case, have we reached an inflection point where perhaps things going forward would be fundamentally different from what they were in the past. Now, in many ways, I think Mr. Trump reflects that sense, and this link between what happens domestically and how that gets reflected on the global stage is one which we have often neglected in terms of if we are studying international relations or if we are studying state behavior. The idea is that, look, structural challenges are more powerful. Inevitably, states respond to those structural challenges. But I think the rise of Trump, in some ways, challenges us to think perhaps more systematically about the role that domestic politics and how the domestic debates play into this larger expression of a state behavior on the global stage. And there, in many ways, Mr. Trump is raising some of the fundamental questions that previous presidents have also been asking. I mean, if you go back to George W. Bush era, a lot of these conversations about the future of arms control, the future of NATO, how much European Union should be spending on defense, how much should American allies be spending on defense in Asia, how much Japan should be spending, South Korea should be spending. I mean, these were the conversations that were going on. I think because of the way he was elected and because of the kind of constituencies that elected him to office, perhaps was forced to reckon with these challenges more prominently than his predecessors. And perhaps had the predecessors done their job well, we would not have a Trump presidency in and of itself. So I think these are fundamental questions that one need to ask when we look at Mr. Trump and when we criticize him, that there is an entire legacy of his predecessors that perhaps from American perspective, from the perspective of American citizens, especially those who felt betrayed by the processes of globalization, felt when they voted Mr. Trump to power. And there was this revulsion against what was happening, what they perceived to be the American elite. And this is a phenomenon not simply prevalent in the US. You look at the entire Western European democratic landscape, the rise of the far right is a tribute to the failure of the liberal left. And that is something that needs to be acknowledged when we are entering into debates about globalization, about the impact of globalization, about what kind of world we want to build, about what kind of a global order needs to come into its place. So I think Mr. Trump, that way is reflective of that reality. I think three points that I just very briefly I want to raise about that come out of the book in particular, because Sreeram does a great job in terms of articulating the challenge that is there for the global order. That you have a global order that is being looked at through this binary of America's relative decline or China's rise. So what is the role of other actors? And I think that's where he posits his argument very, very neatly, because I think we have often ignored the role of other actors, of other interlocutors in the system, and how they interact with themselves would also determine the trajectory of not only what happens to the larger global order, whether it's multipolar, but even if it is the question is about bipolarity. You will not have the kind of bipolarity or G2, for example, if the other actors play their cards right. And I think this is the point that he makes very, very effectively. I think 3 points that I wanted to make just to conclude. One is, this debate on US decline is very interesting, and I think we need to think whether this US decline is now a phenomena that we'll sort of see in every sphere, or whether what we are looking at now is a different phase in the evolution of US foreign policy thinking. Because as I think, as was mentioned by Ambassador Meera Shankar as well, that there is an interesting debate that has happened about the rise of China in the West now, and this is not simply America, but in the entire West, where the whole assumptions about the rise of China are being challenged. So perhaps we are looking at a new phase in the U.S. foreign policy thinking. The other is, this question of global order. And the fact that you can have multiple regional orders, which I think in part Sreeram is arguing, and in some ways the problem might be that even if we have multiple regional orders, adding those multiple regional orders would not a global order make. So in that sense, global order has to be looked at more in terms of how are the basic provisions of basic public goods would be made by these actors, not simply in terms of what India can do perhaps in the Indo-Pacific, or if Africa can do in Africa, etc. So I think that is a question that we need to interrogate a bit more. And finally, I think this book challenges us to think also about the role of, in a way, actors which we don't bring into our day-to-day conversations about multipolarity, for example. So if you're looking at Turkey, Turkey is a classic case of a Middle Eastern power that is trying to reshape the Middle Eastern balance of power. But if you look at the debate on multipolarity, Turkey is not often talked about. So I think it's very interesting that Turkey has been brought in as, in some ways, and Nigeria has been brought in the case of Africa, to sort of expand our map as we go ahead and think about the global order. Perhaps we need to look at who are going to be these poles, if at all we believe that multipolarity is going to be the norm. Thank you.
Thank you. That also anticipates some of the questions I had. So, Mark, do you think this is just a set of argumentative Indians wasting everybody's time, or do you really think there is something to all this?
There's a lot riding on that answer if I give the wrong one. So let me just start off by saying is the mic?
It's working. Just have to be a little closer.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So let me just start off like the rest of the panelists, saying that it's a privilege to be here, to be invited to be on this dais, and it's also just thank you for joining us tonight and being part of this conversation. And thank you, Sreeram, for writing an incredible book. And I'm glad we're all here to discuss it. So I will start off with just like a very quick initial thought, and that in your opening remarks, but also in the book, you talk about this being written for academics and non-specialists. And I can tell you that this is, as someone who's not from an academic background, or not from an academic family, this is the kind of book I would love to give to family members. I would love to give to friends that are thinking about when they hear phrases about emerging powers, a rising India, a more aggressive Turkey. This is a great book for academics, for international relations scholars, for historians of American foreign relations, but also people that are just curious and interested in the larger world and what the future of the world will look like for them, for their children, and for their grandchildren. So I think the book really succeeds in doing that. And I was really pleased in Mr. Raj Kumar's remarks about your work with students. And this feels like definitely a book I would assign to university and undergraduate students to get a sense of the larger world that's going on. And this is a good way to understand the world that will largely shape the rest of their lives. So I'll just have a few quick points about my takeaways from the book, because like the grad student I am, I've read this book cover to cover, so I'm prepared for this big seminar. So I'll say that I think I think you correctly described this, that Trump is not the cause, he's a symptom. I think he used the phrase or the term accelerant. So this is, again, as a historian, I'm always reading IR or political science and being, where's the history? But your historical background helps me tap into these ideas of, in the 1950s, the John Birch Society, Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style of American Politics, the rise of the New Right, conspiracy culture, and they all sort of, in 2014, 2015, collide, and whether you want to call that storm sort of the breakup of the post-Cold War order, or you just want to call it Donald Trump. That is kind of this sort of, these larger forces have converged to create this historical moment. I do think that the book at times talks about the larger narrative, and I think it really taps into the larger narrative of anti-globalization. And to follow on your comments about whether it's in the United States, but parts of Western Europe, really around the world, being more honest and forthcoming about the failures of whether you call it globalization or neoliberalism, but really the economic order since the end of the Cold War that has helped contributed to sort of the rise of Donald Trump, but also just sort of the mixed record of President Barack Obama, who I felt this book had a very nuanced take on Obama's foreign policy. And why I enjoyed reading this book right now was as I was someone who's watching the Democratic Party's the campaign for eventually the nomination. Right now, fidelity and closeness to Obama is a must. Whereas if true liberal Democrats, ones that want to build on and improve on the Obama legacy, would be honest to say that Obama spent much of his first term listening to the celebrity generals, the impressive generals, ignoring diplomacy. And while there are second-term successes like the Iran deal, the Paris Agreement, there are these issues of what happened in the South China Sea, or the rise of ISIS, or problems with Central America that have allowed the border to become the militarized zone that it is right now. Let me use this one. So the last 2 points I'll close on is, as a historian, I mostly look at cultural history, and I enjoyed the work of emotions history or personality studies in IR, and I think the book really taps into, in the India chapter, you talk about, quote, you're talking about Donald Trump and you say, quote, his lifelong conviction that America had for decades been overly magnanimous to relatively strong countries and ended up getting ripped off by everybody in the world. And I think this book is something of interest to people who are looking at personality and emotions. And again, Donald Trump is both a blessing and a curse for scholars like this because he is so emotive on the surface. There isn't a lot of need to dig deeper, but I think we have to get into why somebody who has been successful in business and entertainment and politics still seems to be unfulfilled, or still seems to be looking for some sort of acceptance or some sort of reward. And what does that say about his ideas of trust? Or what about his ideas of acceptance? And the last point that I'll close on is that the book really hammers this idea that when President Trump looks at U.S. foreign policy or looks at the way the government is run, he looks at it in terms of dollars and cents. But he can never really understand influence. He can never understand what the real cost, what power is. It's not something that can be added up on a balance ledger. It can't be something you can put a price tag to. And I think this kind of explains a lot about his life, and that for someone who's been popular, well-known in the United States since the early 80s, he was never really, until his running for president, he was never this big figure in American politics. He was never helping running campaigns. He was never leading a state party. He was never elected to anything. In business, he was a failure repeatedly with different businesses, almost sort of a joke at times. And then in culture, he's not known in the United States culture other than his reality show. So I think someone who's had such a limited to no relationship with influence and power, I think, has suddenly taken the world's most powerful position of influence and power, and still is struggling to understand what it is capable of doing. And I think on the smaller end, the Ukraine situation might be the glimpse of how somebody who comes out of that New York scene of that era, what would happen if they actually do get power. And so it still remains to be seen, but I feel like no matter what happens in that, Donald Trump will still be the American president and the Republican Party's candidate in November of 2020.
Thank you very much, Mark. So thank you very much. My first question is, we should get at least some things out of the way if we have to analyze Sreeram's book thoroughly. One is, are we inexorably moving towards a post-American world? And if by post-American world, if it is the unipolar moment, that's already gone. That we all agree, that the unipolar moment is gone. But by a post-American world, we are talking about quite a sharp decline of US might, especially, and military I know, That's the easy one. But in terms of technology, economy, innovation, artificial intelligence, robotics, are we talking about a steep decline? And if so, does this present a strategic opportunity for the emerging powers? My next question, so that you don't overlap, is can the emerging powers step up to the plate? That will be a different question. I merely want to at least be clear about the landscape. I mean, if it is the unipolar moment, it's gone. That's fine. And militarily, we know that certainly US is up there. I would say Russia is a second. It's not even China, frankly, in pure military terms. But we all know that it's the knowledge economy, so there are other things which are going to make a difference. So in terms of artificial intelligence, robotics, innovation, economy, are we really looking at such a steep decline of US power that this creates a vacuum for other powers to step in? I mean, we will come to whether other powers can do that, but at least get rid of the first question, which is this something we can agree, at least at this stage? Ambassador Meera Shankar.
I think certainly relative US power has declined, and China has risen, and at some point the graphs are going to cross. What that point is going to be, and is it inevitable, I think still is a bit of a question. Whether it is manufacturing, whether it is exports, whether it is new technologies, China has really stepped up and actually emerged as a country which could challenge the United States in each of these frontier areas. And part of the sharpening of Sino-US rivalry, as I see it, is also about who will dominate the technologies of the future, and thereby the economies of the future. A tipping point, if you will, in US-China rivalry emerged when China kept the Silicon Valley companies out of China and created then its own internet companies. So yes, the US is in relative decline. How fast this trend will continue, we don't know, because in the past we have seen the US ability to reinvent itself. And it remains not just militarily powerful, but I think it also remains at the cutting edge of technological innovations. And I think in terms of its education system and the realm of ideas, its capacity to influence the globe. China will rise, and at some point the graph is going to cross, but how fast or how slow this process is going to be, I think is still not something which one can say definitively.
Smita, is that a reasonable proposition for you to accept?
I would tend to agree, because I think, when we are talking about the possible decline of America, and especially where America has been looked upon for upholding a certain kind of an international order. That international order, though, today, of course, has many holes in itself and very questionable. And maybe, as Charles Manning said, that one does not affect the position of a shadow by doing things to the shadow. So you may well end up asking questions about the order itself that the US has for so long tried being the upholder of, by its own choice, and also by the choice of others. It has been put into that position where people have looked onto the American system, the American presidents, to take certain positions on issues. But look, when we talk of the American decline, I think while you also need to see it, how soon are the others catching up? Is that gap really shrinking a lot in terms of the other emerging economies that we talk about? Or if you look at the ranks in, where actually are the other powers placed? Are they higher up today compared to where they were? Or in terms of their own positions, is there a status quo that we are dealing with? Also, with the economy globally being on a downward swing, because I think when you talk about American position or the global order, It is to be driven by the economic positions and the economic challenges that all countries are facing today, including a country like India, where we are seeing the revision of, the downward revision of our growth rates, which have been very central to our, in fact, aspirations as an emerging economy or as an emerging world. So I think for the American decline, it is also the question, as Sreeram maybe puts forward in the book, that is it really about to decline, or is it the lack of willingness to assert itself? Is there a lack of political willingness within the American system? Or is there a genuine sort of an absence of assertion? I think these are also issues that need to be looked about, and definitely the Americans did think of a decline when they voted Donald Trump into power in 2016, because it was not just about the Rust Belt or the job losses. It was a sense of America's losing sort of position on the world stage that translated into a Donald Trump who came and promised that he would swamp the drain.
That's true, and thank you so much for that. Harsh, I know ORF does a lot.
Or drain the swamp, sorry.
ORF does a lot of work on technology and so on. So let me try to ask you a specific question with the same theme, of course. One of my favorite economists now is Mariana Mazzucato, and everybody has heard about her now, the value of everything and so on. One thing that struck me was it is the government of United States and the amount of money they spent on research that actually led to the iPhone, the internet, the touch screen, and the rest of it. I mean, Steve Jobs gets the credit, but really it was the US government expenditure. That expenditure is now reducing, whether you like it or not. Do you think government expenditure in China, do you see that emulating US success somehow? I'm skeptic. But do you see the next big thing being invented in China? That's the question I have for you.
Yes, I frankly, the first part of your, the first question that you had raised, I, as an educator, have a very simple metric. So long as American universities remain in the top 100, 60, 50, I don't think there is a possibility of China taking over. See, no, I think that is something that we need to acknowledge. Even today, where do most of our kids want to go and study? So America, so long as it remains open, so long as it remains it retains its intellectual fertility, I don't think America is going anywhere. The question, I think, obviously for others to consider, and for China and for India to consider, is what is it that we can put now in our systems to enable us to, if not match, but at least to, stand up and be counted. Chinese have done very well, as was pointed out, and Chinese can do well, partly because obviously they have been deep pockets, but also because they have been very strategic. They have gone out and told their researchers working in Stanford, Berkeley, come and we will pay you as much as you want. And I think they've gone back. I think at some point India will have to think about its intellectual capacities and how are we going to build those intellectual capacities. I think Chinese are on their way. But the problem is that if you have a system that is fundamentally opposed to liberty, you cannot be intellectually fertile, innovative. How innovative can you be if you are telling the people, please vote for me, I am the only guarantor of your security, therefore you have to think in a particular way? I think it limits the fundamental options that you have in terms of organizing your society in a way that looks at the future. And therefore, there is a possibility that, at the end of the day, grand strategy is about making your ends and ways meet. Now, my understanding of Trump, and I think Smita pointed that out, is that there is a globalization aspect, but there is also an aspect where the local population was telling something to the liberal constituency in America. And it was telling them, stop these wars. We don't want to fight these wars because you are not investing inside. Look at our roads, look at our airports, look at our damn ports. They are coming out at the seams. No one was listening because you wanted to fight a war in Iraq, you wanted to fight a war. I'm not being facile here, but I think this is an important point from a domestic politics perspective. And so it brought into presidency a president who, I think by default, is being forced to bring that ends and ways into balance. Now, whether he succeeds, whether he fails, on that would hinge America's capacity to reinvent itself.
So, Mark, as a patriotic American,
Right.
what is your honest answer to this question? Are you in perpetual decline, or is the jury still out?
Is there another option? Is there a third choice? So okay, to honestly answer your question, I would say that Americans believe this idea, or they're more likely to encounter this idea of America in decline. But often, if you ask the follow-up, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean you made less money this year? Does that mean your children will never be able to buy a home? It's an abstract feeling without a lot of concrete details. It doesn't mean that people will be out of work for the rest of their working days. It doesn't mean that their children will never go to college. Really, it's one of those things where Americans' perceptions or Americans' exceptions of what middle class or what a prosperous life look like, they may change small on the margins, but it isn't anything that, it's the difference between going from, 8 to 10 as opposed to 1 to 2. It's much smaller on the margin. So, but Americans have been sort of in this perpetual state of anxiety really since the end of the Cold War. I mean, this is sort of a thing in foreign relations scholarship that the United States wins the Cold War and suddenly looks around and feels that they had this kind of lonely victory, that at the same time that the Soviet Union is falling apart, the U.S. is fighting with Japan over trade wars, thinking that somehow Japan won the Cold War, or somehow the Brazil and Russia and India and China, these emerging these countries are all going to take something away from them. There's this idea of Americans having something ripped from them, and I think in the book you quote somebody who says that with Donald Trump, it's not them giving it up, or not them having it taken away, it's more they're giving it up, which is something that I don't think Americans were necessarily thinking of when they were, voting for this idea of perceived decline. So let me go back a little bit further to, it's something that, I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. Was there a second part of the question too, or?
No, I was basically going to.
Yeah. Oh, I lost it again. I'm sorry.
No problem, Mark.
Yeah.
We'll come back to you.
Yeah, it might come back.
We just spent another 15 minutes. Ambassador Veera Shankar and others have to leave as well, so we will make it as intense as possible. No, Sreeram's book, to be fair, is a call to arms for emerging countries, right? He says to emerging powers which must heed the call of destiny.
Yeah.
So, rather than get into this debate about whether there is an opportunity, a vacuum, whether the decline is perpetual, irreversible, etc., let's assume that there will be an opportunity in the future. We don't know when. So this is a tough one. What should emerging and developing countries do? Mark,
I remember my quick, I had 3 quick points. So the first one was that this idea of a decline, I would characterize it more as a warning to Americans that, again, we look back on this golden age after World War II of, an expanding middle class, of full employment, of more people entering higher education, but that wasn't just a wish, that wasn't just a fantasy, that involved real investment. You had to invest in people, there had to be real agreement between corporations and unions, there had to be a real investment in human capital as opposed to just wanting to be a stronger power. And then this idea, I remember, I was, an adult, when the George W. Bush administration was ending, there was all this talk about, after Bush, will there be multilateralism? As the U.S. forever tarnished its outreach to the world. And as we saw, maybe Obama is an exception, maybe the world was just ready to just have a non-George W. Bush presidency. But again, even in the late 2000s, there was this idea that somehow diplomacy was dead or the U.S. would never have its influence again. And I feel like the Obama era managed to bring some of that back to the point where I feel when he left, there was so much goodwill. The sort of goodwill dividend was very strong. But then the last point I want to make is that, again, we see the idea of U.S. military supremacy. We see the economic argument is still sort of up in the air. It sort of goes back and forth in the U.S. and China. What I'll say is that U.S. cultural power, that U.S. movies, U.S. television, U.S. literature, U.S. media is still a dominating force. I've lived in India for a year, and I've seen people of all ages. They wear Marvel Comics t-shirts. They have the comic book characters. As of now, I don't think the largest movie in China if it opened in the United States, it would be seen by more than 1 million people. U.S. cultural power is still what, when I'm on the metro, when people are looking at Netflix, when they're looking at YouTube, when they're listening to Spotify, some of these may be based in other countries, but they mostly operate in Silicon Valley. The U.S. is still the technological and cultural power and until you see a China, India, I would love to see more Indian cultural power in the United States, trust me. Until that's still sort of the secret trump card, if you will.
Thank you, Mark. No, I want to develop further on the central thesis of the book written by Sreeram, which is, as I said, the call of destiny to emerging powers. I'm going to start again with Ambassador Meera Shankar. What can emerging powers do, apart from two things, because we've heard that already? That is, one, you try to do what United States has done. You can emulate the top universities and try to, as Harsh said, liberty, we can do all that. Or we try and see if we can cooperate among each other. Because you can do what India and others are doing, that is try and be a balancing power or a hedging power. But other than these time-tested strategies, can the emerging powers do something different so that when the time comes, as you know, let's assume that Sreeram's book is right, and I hope he is right, that there is an opportunity for emerging powers to kind of step up to the plate. How do you think we should do things differently? And I know it's off the top of your head, it's a little tough, but you can try to emulate the United States. That's no-brainer. We should try to do that. But that might be already fit for an earlier era. Or the Chinese model, frankly, is not such a great model. They've shut out, Google and Amazon and Twitter, and they have these local companies. Alibaba, Tencent, whatever. I don't see that happening in India. So Europe and India are really the only entities which don't have tech giants right now. So I'm just mentioning one example, but more generally speaking, following on from the book, what can these middle powers do to make this possible, to make this era our era, so to speak? Even if US and China occupy a certain space, if you assume that the US is going to decline and China is catching up, it leaves some space for the others to operate. So I'm at a loss, I must be honest with you, but I'd be very interested. This is as distinguished a panel as any, at least the one I have seen, and it'll be interesting to know, just from your different perspectives, what can the middle powers, whether it is India, Brazil, Nigeria, Turkey, whichever country you like, other than US, China, of course, what can we do differently?
I think the first focus will have to be internal and accelerating economic growth, dealing with human, social issues or social development, education, health, building military capacities, including the capacities for indigenous production. In India, a huge problem. In the areas where we have, the nuclear space programs, we've succeeded because there was a technology denial regime in place which forced us, in a sense, to build our capacities. In the field of defense and other strategic technologies where it's been easy for us to import, we've chosen that route, and we haven't really created the space to tide over a period of transition where you may not have the best, but you would be building your indigenous capacities. Then I think really trying to create more groups of middle powers within the region, see what you can do for economic integration. Not easy when you don't have the manufacturing capacity. So all of it flows from that, from the lack of economic capacity. Then you interact with the world in a certain way. And then, what India has done, that is, you have created multiple groupings which I would call the variable geometry of cooperation. So you have Russia, India, China on the one hand, you have America, India, Japan on the other, you have America, India, Japan, Australia, you have the G20, you are part of this Central Asian grouping and so on. So you've created these various groups to give you the flexibility to cooperate with countries in areas where you might have a comity of interests. And finally, much more active engagement with the international system and shaping the rules and policies of that system. Because I think that is what determines, in a sense, the extent of autonomy you can exercise over your choices. Quite often we just take whatever is coming from outside, whether it is cybersecurity or others. How do we shape the rules so that we have the space to kind of realize some potential which might be inherent in our societies?
It's interesting.
Economic growth and political and social cohesion, both are important. If you look at Brazil, if you look at Nigeria, if you look at India, I think we are vulnerable there because we have extreme divisiveness at the moment in terms of what the future of our society should be.
Thank you. Smita, any serious disagreement with that?
No, I couldn't agree more, in fact, with Ambassador Meera Shankar, because I think you have to look at the changed American foreign policy as we see today, or its projection of its power on the world stage, or a lack of willingness to do so, from the internal debates happening in America. I mean, when a David Brooks in New York Times writes about the rising tide America to coming apart America, you know what people there are talking about. It's driven by what's happening internally as well. And that's a projection of what's happening on Trump's foreign policy approach. So similarly, I think, it has to be about people fixing their own homes. It has to be about fixing things internally. It has to be not just about the economy, which, as I mentioned earlier, will be key in how the world order shapes up or whatever way the countries move, but also about social cohesion. I mean, a lot of the friction that you see in America today, what they are debating about is it on the path of becoming this white, conservative Christian country? Is that going to change the way American institutions function forever? I mean, the American institutions are also the ones that have continued to be resilient and give hope in comparison to the institutions in India today, many of which seem to be falling like 9 pins. But, in America, I mean, one of the biggest worries has been that by the time Trump leaves White House, would the nature of the American Supreme Court have changed? So if the internal debate there, internal polarization there is driving how Trump, he still hasn't gone to war with Iran or North Korea. He knows that a war is not good for the American appetite at the moment, for the political appetite. Other than, of course, drowning maybe, some tit-for-tat action happening with the Iranians on missiles and drones, where, in fact, Americans would have been expected to think on a larger scale as to how does that really affect the global energy flow, does that impact the energy flow or not. So, and Obama, who does have the serious blots of a Syrian war or the situation in Libya, still continues to be thought about as somebody who's erudite and perhaps thought about the world more, which is not the case with Trump, who's even called as the angel of destruction. But to rise up, I mean, if you're looking at the American power on decline, as I said, what are the other powers doing to be in a position where they are stronger today? And if you're not able to make up for, be it the cultural cohesion, the social cohesion, I mean, the Chinese have opened one Confucius center after the others. The Indian soft power that we talk about, unfortunately, we are still restricting ourselves to a Bollywood or to yoga. I mean, why are we not talking about the think tanks? Why are we not talking about the academic expertise? So, and also, I think, when you, Prime Minister Modi, it was at the SAARC summit in Kathmandu, Ambassador Kumar, where he spoke about sub-regionalism. So I think going forward, these countries will also have to look at not just multilateralism, but sub-multilateralism, and try and find the common interest grounds of how they really define the liberal orders, Because a lot of the multilateral alliances that we talk about today are also unnatural and not really the naturally coming ones.
I think you're spot on there. But talking of internal, I mean, it's all right to kind of lavish praise on China's rise, but I'd like to point out that there are issues there. The Xinjiang being the most important, but there's also Tibet. There are other issues of internal cohesion. Yes, please.
Mention that the inevitability of China's rise is also something which you have to at least be skeptical about, because they have their own dissonance. You have an open market system, they call it a socialist market economy, but you have a closed political system. And that contradiction between an open market system and a closed political system, can they continue to manage those contradictions? Because they've done it in the past on the promise of very rapid economic growth. If that economic growth slows down, will they be able to actually handle it? And to the point that Harsh was making, that if, and under Xi, we are seeing a kind of, because before there was a certain loosening up of the Chinese system, but under Xi, we are seeing a centralization and control back with the party. If you have a party nominee on every research committee, on every company, in every university, will that actually encourage creativity or create a climate in which people can actually exchange ideas freely? And if you can't exchange ideas freely, where's that creativity going to come from? So it's not that China's rise is inevitable.
No, that's a good point, and I take that point completely. I'm going to finish with the next two speakers and then ask Sreeram to give his right of response as an author. Harsh, would it be fair to say that in India's case, therefore, following up from what Ambassador Meera Shankar and Smita have said, that the foreign policy and our foreign engagement is maybe in danger of going much ahead of our internal situation? I mean, I know
internal capacity.
Internal capacity, if you like. So you get the drift of what I'm asking. So can you please respond to that, Harsh?
Yeah, see, capacity problem, obviously, better than I do, that capacity problem is a severe problem as far as India is concerned, not simply in terms of our bureaucracy, in terms of our even universities and think tanks and the sort of ideational space. But I think, in other ways where you're looking at basic economic infrastructure or social infrastructure, social capital as it is called, that is a problem. I'm a bit skeptical about this idea that social cohesion is sort of a sine qua non for a great power. We often forget America was a great power during civil war. There was crises in America, 70s, 80s. China is being talked of as a great power. They're great power when they are running, internment in camps across their territory. So I think a traditional notion of great power discounts these factors. It's more about capacities. If you have the capacity to project power on the global stage, you can be a Hitler inside. I don't think. From an analytical point of view, that does not matter. From a benchmark. No, I'm just saying from an analytical point of view, it doesn't really matter. What matters at the end of the day, from a moralistic point of view, whether you're looking at what kind of a power what kind of an international order we want to look at, or we want to envisage being a part of, that I think is important. Otherwise, all societies are internally divided. No society is perfect, and I don't think that's a benchmark. But the point that you had raised earlier about what can India do in India, I think at some point a certain kind of risk taking becomes important. I like the fact that we all talk of hedging, but you cannot continuously be hedging all the time on the global stage. And unless you do that, unless you tell your friends and your adversaries that there are times when you will draw the red line, that you will take a decision, I think you have to think twice, because you see, we are all very proudly say we want to be on the Security Council. But think down in our hearts, do we really want to be there? On every single decision, you have to make a choice. I think at the end of the day, those kind of questions come to haunt you. They come to sort of dictate how you engage with the world. And therefore, even as sort of we rise in the global power hierarchy, There are many questions that all these countries that are here in the book, some not here in the book, part of BRICS, BRICS Plus, all of them are grappling with, and I think at the end of the day we all want that these countries should be providing certain kinds of global public goods from a global perspective, and if they are not doing that, then I think the world inevitably will go either the Chinese way or the American way.
Thank you, Harsh. There's one book that I do want to recommend to the audience, especially if you want to pursue this line, look at the international order. Michael O'Sullivan, who's a Princeton economist, he's written a book called The Levelers, and this is about post-globalization. Take a look at it. Very, very interesting book about regimes in the future which will either be the levelers. It goes back to the Putney debates in London, and the levelers failed spectacularly. You'll have two kinds of powers. Powers which are democratic and which are open, obviously US and the West, and then you will have regimes like Russia and China, which will rule the roost. So take a look at that book. Mark, my question to you is a little different from what I asked these three illustrious panelists. Why is the US dumping alliances, you think? Is this an idiosyncrasy of President Trump? Or, I mean, you have this long transatlantic alliance.
Right.
You have a commitment to NATO. You have a commitment to Japan. You have a commitment to the West. And it seems to me, at least as an outsider, that he is bringing a wrecking ball and just blasting these things. Is this just negotiating posture, or is it something more serious than that? And is there a bipartisan consensus, for example, that in NATO other powers should pay, and that the US strongly feels that other countries are taking advantage of it?
I think, so let me answer it in two ways. So the first is that, the book, your book really reminded me of this recent work called Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild, a sociologist, who looked at people in the southern United States and sort of how they sort of got their conservative ideas, even though in an area that would have benefited from more liberal policies, particularly on economic issues. And a lot of it tapped into sort of cultural ideas about religion or work or the role of the family. But they definitely had this idea that women, certain women, but particularly immigrants and people of color, were getting ahead of them. They were cutting the line. They were cheating. And they saw Barack Obama as the epitome of people trying to help people that didn't look like them. And they said they felt like strangers in their own land. So in your book, you talk about, Trump has sort of tapped into this idea that other countries are ripping the United States off. They're taking advantage of us. So there is this idea within American culture, it's a bipartisan idea that non-white people are trying to get ahead, and whatever way they get ahead is probably through illicit or unethical or through sort of devious means. So there is that sort of taps into that idea. To go back into the sort of larger point that there is this bipartisan consensus, or at least a majority consensus, that the U.S. is tired post 9/11. And for someone like me, a youngish person, I'll say, my touchstones as an adult have been the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Iraq War, and the financial crisis. And clearly, someone who's grown up at a time, I look at maybe my grandparents or people who grew up in the 60s and they saw the moon landing, or they saw the building of the Interstate Highway Commission, or they saw the GI Bill, they saw just the end of World War II, and they see American or Western triumphalism. They see what happens when people work together and they conquer a larger evil. Where someone like me looks at the failures of government, of business, of culture, of all these things that have been mostly of my lifetime of decline. And I think certainly with the combination of the 9/11 attacks, which forever it already made an anxious, worried country even more neurotic. I think there's this idea that America is tired, America is beaten, America is ready to hand it off to somebody. And Donald Trump ran explicitly on this idea that we are no longer the world's policemen. And for people who have seen their soldiers in Afghanistan for longer than the Vietnam War, for people that children that were not born, who were born after 9/11, who are now able to join the military and go off to a war that existed before they were even born. There's just this American, just tiredness, or just this American it's hard to pinpoint it, but there's this idea that we need to turn the page on this. And there was hope that Obama might do that, might have been somebody to bring things back. And in some ways he did, but I think Trump is much more willing to do that, and to do it particularly for political gain, for, so he can run on a promise of, I brought troops home, I did this, even if the actual withdrawal or retreat is more complicated than it seems.
Thank you, Mark. Sreeram, you've been an agent provocateur par excellence. Really, I think your book is brilliant in terms of the questions it poses. It's not easy to bring answers to questions like this, but my frank assessment, this is a brilliant book that raises tough questions on really what the international order is going to look like, what countries should do to prepare themselves. I think that is the kind of yeoman service that your book has served. But you will have the last word before I request the Vice Chancellor to facilitate the guests. So you have a couple of minutes, please.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Mohan. Thank you. I think I've never seen a more intense and intellectually robust dialogue on global issues despite being part of this Lutyens circuit for 10 years. So thank you to my panelists, and I don't think we have seen a higher quality of discussion yet on global order like this. So I think Henry Kissinger would have applauded if he was in the audience. I'll just say a couple of things. One is about the hot spots. You see, this puts a lot of premium on the ability of rising powers to resolve the hotspots in their immediate surroundings. So Venezuela for Brazil, I hope Bolivia doesn't become another one, it's likely to be. Syria and Iraq for Turkey, Afghanistan and the Indo-Pacific for India, and the Sahel, and in fact entire Pan-African problem of continental integration for Nigeria. So what I'm saying is that, there's a formulation that powers are recognized by their deeds, not by their words, right? Talk is cheap, we say. And so each of these, for me, the litmus test is, can we resolve the most pressing hotspots in our respective neighborhoods without having to piggyback on the United States or without having to bring in the Chinese? And in each of the chapters, I'm talking about one such litmus case for each of these countries, in some cases 2 litmus cases. And I urge you all to read the book and to make up your mind. So capacities, internal, sub-regionalism, these are all fantastic, but all for what end? In my view, when we say net, our Prime Minister has a famous phrase, net provider of security and stability in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, in Asia. So that's the thing, see, and I really hope that this book, if nothing else, it prods our strategic elites in our respective countries to think, here is a problem that's going to come back and haunt me. For example, Afghanistan for India. Okay, here is Trump packing up and leaving in a hurry. There's going to be no more reliance on NATO. We cannot, expect them to stay on and on forever. What do we do next? Before the cookie crumbles, or before Humpty Dumpty falls down from the wall, That's the big challenge. Now I think if rising powers realize it, we prioritize these stabilization of these hotspots. I think we have already demonstrated power and influence, because power and influence comes from being, and especially hegemony, although I don't think these countries are aspiring to that, but it comes from acceptance of others, right? That's the basic definition. And that's only possible if we do something right. The example of Nigeria I've given with Gambia, for example. I don't know if we have anyone from the region here. Buhari intervened in the Gambia, and he told Yahya Jammeh, the dictator of Gambia, if you want to oppose the region, you're welcome to do it, but we will take action. They intervened, and democracy was restored in the Gambia, tiny country. Nigeria has that ability. Nigeria has that power. People always, the Western discourse always, these countries are corrupt. Nigeria is the most corrupt country on earth. after Somalia and Afghanistan. That's how it's been portrayed. I'm challenging that in this book from taking a southern perspective. Who made some of the Nigerian elites corrupt? Who made some of these rising powers weak? You know, you look at the role of Shell Oil and Exxon Mobil in Nigeria, and you get the answer, right? So what I'm saying is, these countries have the capacity to resolve the hotspots. If we can prioritize each of us, say this is the number one major regional security problem or challenge, and I can take the lead along with 10 others and resolve this problem. I can win the trust of my neighbors, and together we'll do it. That's a demonstration of power. We don't need Trump, and certainly not Xi Jinping. Thank you.
Can I just add on a lighter note, Sreeram, that while you do say that we don't need a Trump, but thankfully there is a Trump, so there is a book today, as you mentioned in the book itself, that he might be belligerent, he might be unpredictable, he might invite the Taliban for talks to Camp David on a 9/11 anniversary, and mercifully, of course, then disinvite them. But at the end of the day, if there was no record, if there was a Hillary Clinton, I'm not sure you would have the content for this book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trump.